Welcome back. I hope everybody's adequately caffeinated. We are obviously running a little bit behind, so we're going to try to make up for a bit of lost time during the next session, but we do want to make sure that we get a chance to take your questions. When we talk about renewable energy in the Middle East, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, the actual conversation taking place in many Gulf countries has moved on from should we have renewables to where do renewables fit into our policy mix, and how do we go even further? According to the IRENA's data, by 2030, the region could save 354 million barrels of oil equivalent. That's a 23% reduction, create more than 250,000 jobs, and reduce the power sector's carbon dioxide emissions by 22%. And that's based on the current renewable targets set already today. But what about the Arab countries who don't have the deep pockets of their GCC neighbors? How can they attract investment? And where does British expertise and innovation fit into this? Well, to talk about all of these topics, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Ranald Spiers from Alcazar Energy, who will lead us through this discussion. He has over 30 years' experience in the sector, working with Masdar in the UAE, many of you will know, International Power, BP, and he's overseen water and power projects worth billions of dollars. And at Alcazar Energy, the focus is primarily on solar and onshore wind technologies. Mr. Spiers, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Royal Highness, Your Excellencies, my Lords, ladies and gentlemen, no issue is more pressing to all of us than the fate of the planet and whether mankind will survive the effects of global warming. Keeping the rise in temperature to manageable levels may seem an impossible task, but the ingenuity of mankind may come to our rescue. Our thirst for energy and decisions to supply this demand by renewable or non-renewable energy is at the forefront of this battle. Today we hear from 4 speakers about renewable developments within the Middle East region, which has been slower than most other regions to implement renewable solutions. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say any more because we're approximately 40 minutes late. Each speaker is going to speak for 7 minutes maximum, otherwise I will be up and down like Tower Bridge. Our first speaker is Dr. Abdulaziz Hamad Aluwaisheg, who is the Assistant Secretary General for the GCC for Political and Negotiation Affairs. Dr. Abdulaziz.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know you're waiting for lunch, so I'll be very brief. I would like to speak about energy security in the Arab world and how it can provide opportunities for business. So first, I will identify some features of energy insecurity, vulnerabilities in other words, and how to do and what to do about them. First, demand for energy in the Arab world seriously outpaces population growth and economic growth. I'll give you one example, Saudi Arabia. Demand for energy grows annually at 8%, while economic growth and population growth are less than 3%. So obviously this cannot be sustained, and this is true for the rest of the Arab world. So that's one reason for energy insecurity. And all efforts at demand management have not worked very well because we still see that discrepancy between energy demand and population growth and economic growth. One of the reasons, of course, is energy prices. Energy prices are out of sync with the actual cost of energy for countries that import it and out of sync with international prices for countries that produce fuel. So there is little incentive for power generators to economize and for people to conserve. The regulatory and institutional frameworks have not coped with this challenge of this discrepancy between energy demand and energy capabilities. Public transportation. People are moving to the cities, but there isn't enough public transportation available for them, so they use energy-intensive modes of transportation, single cars. Now, I am the Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs and Negotiations. Why am I concerned about it? Because that state of affairs is a strategic liability. I'll tell you why. In the GCC, 95% of our energy is derived from oil and natural gas. And if growth continues at 8%, then we will not be able to sustain the government revenues because we depend on the export of oil and gas. And also for countries that do not export oil and gas, 25% to 30% of the typical Arab budget from non-oil producing countries goes to energy subsidies. That, of course, cannot be sustained if demand keeps growing. So what can we do about it? And how can the private sector help? There are, of course, other challenges that I don't want to go over them. You know them about air pollution and the need to meet climate change standards and all of that. You know all of that. But what to do about it, I think, is probably the more interesting question. First, there is an untapped market. According to UN figures, there are about 50 million people in the Arab world who don't have basic access to electricity. So there is that market that can be tapped by energy producers. And for the rest who already have basic energy supplies, there are ways to improve that energy supply by managing demand, putting limits on people's use of energy by either using the price mechanism or giving price incentives. I lived in the United States in the 70s and 80s when the United States had to cope with this problem, with the rising energy cost and how they need. So they reduced the speed limits. But I think more interestingly, they subsidized energy-saving mechanisms for developers, for homeowners, for everybody. And those have worked so well that they're still continuing 40 years later. And we need to do that. Yes, there is an initial cost for them, but I think they need to be done. Energy-saving mechanisms are not cheap. So I think to help people afford them, to help people use them, we need to use incentives. In addition to the stick, of course, which is in building codes, in import limitations on non-energy efficient appliances and cars, all of that. So I think we need to do both. We need to do retrofitting for existing structures, existing power stations to try to make them more efficient, and that can be done. But I think the government have to, and the international donors have to help. And the private sector is the source for these improvements. Most of these technologies are available in the private sector. So you can do good while you are doing well. I think businesses can provide that service, of course, while doing very well. And Britain, in particular, as the previous speaker said, is well placed to do that. Businesses here are able to do this because you've had an energy crisis for a long time, and now we've had the energy crisis in the region, energy security, only the last decade or so, or at least we became aware of it the last decade or so. So one of the objectives is energy efficiency, I mentioned, but also improving the energy mix. So we are not, as I said, 95% reliant on fossil fuel, that we use other renewables, other sources of energy. Saudi Arabia is believed to have the potential to become the largest producer of solar energy in the world, but right now it produces very little. Again, you need to think a lot of investment for that, aided by the public sector, but I think will have to be implemented by the private sector. One very interesting area of cooperation that at the GCC we started working on it is expanding the regional common market in energy. We already have a common market in energy between the 6 countries. We have one electric grid for all 6 member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The GCCIA now has excess capacity and can be scaled up, and we are in discussions with Iraq and some of our neighbors to see if they would like to connect to this source of energy. We produce energy cheaper than anybody else in the region, and we're able to do that. In order to connect the Iraqi and the GCC networks, you need some investment. We did a quick study, and it's about $250 million, which is not prohibitive for the savings that will happen in the long term. So creating that common market in the region will improve access to electricity, will reduce costs to industries and to the people. A couple of other initiatives I'll just mention that we established with the EU, the GCC-EU Diversification Project. One of the focus areas of this project is energy efficiency and renewables, the development of renewables. Last week, the government of Abu Dhabi announced a major initiative of 9 points where they provide both sticks and carrots, mostly carrots in fact, to improve diversification of energy sources and improving affordability and having a differentiated price structure for industry. So and Saudi Arabia a while ago established the Saudi Center for Energy Efficiency, which has been instrumental in establishing building codes and introducing government legislation to limit the importation of energy inefficient appliances and cars, and so on. So I think there is plenty of work to do. There's great demand for the improving the energy security. There are untapped needs in the Arab world, and I think we here in the GCC British Strategic Partnership, which was established in 2016, I think we can help connect the business, the private business here and private business in the Arab world to satisfy those needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdulaziz. And I call upon Frank Gordon, who's Head of Policy and Renewable at the Renewable Energy Association. Frank.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to keep this brief, so I won't go through all of my slides. You may be relieved to hear. Essentially, just a quick word, first of all, about who we are. We're the Renewable Energy Association, the REA. We're the largest trade body for renewables and clean tech in the UK. Over 550 members across power, heat, transport, energy storage, and also recycling. And we run the usual programme of events, provide information and policy analysis and advice for our members. This is what I really wanted to start off with, which is some of the benefits of going renewable. So a lot of people know of renewables as probably the best way to decarbonise our energy systems and therefore our wider societies. But what a lot of people aren't necessarily so aware of is the massive reductions in costs in the last few years, which have meant that wind and solar especially are the cheapest form of large-scale generation, certainly in this country, and reaching that across many parts of the world as well, and Europe especially. So there's huge growth across the world. At the moment, we're at about 35% renewable electricity in the UK, which is hugely significant, as that's coming from a very low base just 5 years ago. So it's growing at a huge pace. There's massive opportunities here. Many of the technical challenges which we encountered previously in certain technologies have now been overcome. And there's a wide range of other benefits from installing renewables. So just briefly to set the context in the UK, we operate within the Climate Change Act 2008, which set a series of carbon budgets on a 5-year basis down to 2050. Which ratchet down our carbon emissions. And the Committee on Climate Change, which advises government on the best way to meet these carbon targets, has consistently identified as renewable energy as the best way of meeting these carbon reduction targets. So it's the most effective, cheapest way of decarbonising the UK economy, essentially. And I'm very pleased to say that just within the last few weeks, the UK government have committed to a net zero 2050 greenhouse gas emissions target, which is a fantastic milestone achievement, the first in the world. And it goes to show that if we can do it here, then others can as well. We also have a series of renewable energy targets in particular. So by 2020, we need to have 15% of all energy consumed to be from renewable sources. And that's broken down into sub-targets for electricity, heat and transport. How are we doing against that? We're doing pretty well on the power side, on the electricity side. I mentioned we're about 35% as of the most recent quarter. But we're lagging behind on heat and on transport at the moment. So the biggest single source of emissions in the UK is now transport. So there's a lot of emphasis on decarbonising the transport system. But obviously renewables have a huge part to play in that side of it as well. This is just a graph from our annual publication review, which summarises the progress against our renewable targets. And you can see there, as of the first quarter of this year, we're at 35.8% renewable electricity. But as I mentioned, lagging behind a little bit on heat and transport, which are about half where we need to be at. And of course, we've got a range of different technologies as well. So people think of renewables as wind and solar a lot of the time, but what they don't always recognise is that bioenergy, things like biomass power and biofuels, actually produce about a third of the renewables in the UK, and it's similar in other parts of Europe. So there's lots of technologies, it's not just wind and solar. So looking forwards, there's a clear basis for investing in renewables in this country and around the world. Hopefully I don't need to go into that too much, but as I mentioned, the cost of solar, the cost of wind are coming down so considerably that it creates huge opportunities. So that a new large-scale solar farm or wind plant could be built for around £45 a megawatt hour in the UK tomorrow. And that's less than half the price of a new build nuclear power plant. So, and gas would be around £75, £85 a megawatt hour in the UK. So, yeah, the costs are there. It's a viable investment, it really is. And something to touch on just briefly as well is that in the UK context, what we've seen is a decoupling of economic growth from carbon emissions. So this graph just really shows that in the last 35 years we've had significant economic growth, while at the same time our carbon emissions have come down. And that is in large part due to energy efficiency, but also to the deployment of more renewable energy. So this is a real way of not damaging our economy, whilst at the same time decarbonising, as we know we need to do. Here's some forecasts which I won't go into. And we believe the energy system in the UK and Europe is evolving really into a more decentralised landscape, so moving away from large points of generation, large points of consumption, to distributed smaller points of energy generation consumed locally next to where it's produced. This will create lots of new exciting opportunities. For example, the rollout of energy storage, which is a perfect combination with variable renewables such as wind and solar, because it helps smooth out the generation profile onto the grid, and therefore mitigating one of the main criticisms in the past of some forms of renewable energy. And the costs of this are coming down as well. Some costs on that. Yes, this is starting to be deployed at scale in the commercial and industrial sector in the UK. Lots of new business models emerging, solar plus storage, plus other IT equipment, and EV charging on site, for example, which is leading us into more of a combined cross-energy vector play, where you've got the development of on-site charging alongside battery storage, alongside energy generation. So the power is being produced on site, stored on site, and then consumed on site as well, which is more efficient and is allowing new business models to emerge. Yes, as we're in London, which has a very bad air quality reputation, unfortunately, at the moment. Worth noting as well the benefits of renewables to air quality. The transport sector is the biggest source of this in London in terms of air quality problems, and this can start to be addressed through battery electric vehicles, which don't emit the particulates which form lots of the air quality problems. So that's another big driver for renewables going forwards. We've got a lot of growth in the low-carbon vehicle sector, including electric vehicles and light commercial vans, for example, that one there. But there's still less than around 200,000 EVs in the UK, so we're starting from quite a small base, although it's growing very quickly. But like I said, in the future, electric vehicles will start to drive new business models for renewables in terms of on-site generation and consumption. And obviously, it's not just us saying this. Some of the world's biggest corporates are investing heavily in renewables. We've got the RE100 group, which is a group of some of the largest corporates on the planet, who have committed to 100% renewable power. So they're seeing the business benefit alongside the environmental imperative. These are some of the companies involved in that. So just to summarise, before I get booted off the stage, this is a quick cartoon. Apologies for this, but it's quite a nice summary of some of the benefits of why we're doing this. And you know, there's climate change, which is one driver, but there's a myriad of other drivers. Cost, I mentioned a lot. The new jobs which are going to come out of this, increased efficiency, the benefits for tackling air pollution, the health benefits, and the economic opportunities for all. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I now would like to introduce Dr. Samira Omar Assam, who's the Director General of the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. Dr. Samira.
It's a great honor for me to be here presenting you the experience of the state of Kuwait in renewable energy. I'm very grateful to the Kuwait Commerce and for inviting me for this very special event. Actually, my presentation covers the progress of renewable energy so far in the state of Kuwait. In the beginning, I would be pleased to give you background information very quickly about the setup of the country. As you already know, Kuwait is located in the northeast region of the Arabian Peninsula. The surface area is about 18,000 square kilometers. The country climate is very harsh during summer, extremely hot. Maybe it goes beyond any other cities in the world. The climate is important when we talk about energy because we need a lot of cooling. Most of the Kuwaitis remain indoors, and the cooling system is very important for the survival, the well-being and life of the Kuwaitis. At the same time, we have a lot of dust storms that also affect a lot of machines, and so the technology that we develop and import and apply in the country has to be suitable to our environmental conditions and constraints. The economy of Kuwait is well established, and as I have some information about its GPA, nominal is about 141.7 billion, with an average increase in 5 years of 0.4%. The primary source of energy, as you already know, Kuwait is an oil-producing country, is primarily on the oil production, which is the Kuwait Petroleum Corporate has a continuous strategic program to develop this sector in terms of producing crude oil and exporting it or from the refineries as a product from the oil. And the country is about 90% of the revenues come from the oil exportation. The petroleum corporate also is concerned about the gas import, because the gas production in Kuwait is under lots of constraints, and there is a need to import, and we have established collaboration with the Shell company to import gas for 15 years. However, the KPC is still looking for potential for local production of gas. How this all important source of petroleum and the gas and the byproducts is being consumed partially by the government and mostly exported. The amount that is being used for the government is mainly used for the industry and for the domestic use. The industry, the maximum industrial operation that utilizes this source of energy is desalination for freshwater, potable water production. As you already know, Kuwait is a desert. It doesn't have natural water resources, so it depends entirely on the desalinated, which comes from the sea. What technology we use is mainly the multi-stage flush, which is very popular, and we have many water stations that are being developed with this technology. However, also RO is a potential technology, reverse osmosis, that is now being considered. And we expect that the RO will expand to 13% in the near future. Now, if we keep this business as usual and we keep producing water and utilize these energy sources, then it is expected that there will be increase of to reach 30% of energy supply by 2030. And transportation is also important, which utilizes the fuel that is generated from petroleum. And the domestic, as I mentioned, 70% of domestic use of energy is used for cooling, which is very high consider. Kuwait is challenged by many external and internal business and environmental, marketing, economy. And among these is the fluctuation, volatile prices of oil that affect the economy. As you already know, this affects also the production of oil in time. And the Kuwait, it is highly an intensive use of energy compared to other Middle Eastern countries and OECD. It's highly above the normal amount. And for the last 15 years, Kuwait consumed an average of 0.25 ton of oil equivalent to produce 1,000 of gross domestic products. The harsh climate and the harsh environment and the lack of fresh water lead to the intensive use of energy and cooling. Consequently, Kuwait is also producing high emission, which is now important to look at strategies in tackling and alleviating these problems. Kuwait prepared a white paper for the strategy for renewable energy as a source of clean energy that could be used and expanded in the future. And the strategy has been presented to the government for sustainable natural energy production in Kuwait. Based on that, it looks at different elements for developing renewable energy to produce sustainable source of energy by expanding our potential for using solar energy and wind energy, and to develop technologies that are suitable to our environment and meet His Highness the Emir vision for the future to reach 15% of the demand by renewable energy up to year 2030. From economic point of view, there is a mitigation opportunity of relieving or freeing some of our oil and oil products for more exports and international markets. At the same time, establishing new sectors in local economy through new renewable technologies and business opportunities, as we encourage the private sector to also contribute in developing renewable technology and expand in its application. So the business opportunity will create more jobs for the local Kuwaitis, and also from the environmental point of view, it has a lot of benefits for reducing emission and mitigating environmental constraints and greenhouse emissions, and advanced operation to ensure safety and security of the environment. The strategy also looks at how we expand relationship with the stakeholders, integrate the efforts, at the same time involve the private sector and have access to information, and also increase the business related to this area of involving in R&D. The primary renewable resources is solar energy, wind energy, and we also use different technologies for renewable, for solar, like CSP and PV. As research institute, we started the R&D, research and development, way time in the late 70s, when we established solar houses, and we started testing at a pilot stage, developing solar cooling, solar renewed traffic lights, solar water desalination, solar furnaces, solar thermal plants. And however, all these efforts were suspended at some point in 1988, unfortunately, because of the drop in the price of oil. At the same time, the renewable energy wasn't very strongly internationally. It was weak at that time, as technology was very expensive and more sophisticated than now. Our present status in 2010, we reactivated as Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research the activities in developing new resources, national renewable strategy established, and in 2000 renewable vision for His Highness the Emir, as I mentioned, to meet the 15% demand for renewable resource in 2030. I'm going to finish this. Sorry. Currently, the Research Institute has established a Center for Energy and Building, which provided a first pilot station for producing 70 megawatt from solar and wind energy. And this has been completed in 2019. And what we believe that this is a model for the country of Kuwait to establish a larger scale production up to 4 megawatts in the year, 4,000 megawatts, sorry, up for the year 2030. And this is in order to be done in collaboration with Kuwait Petroleum Cooperates, and to integrate it with the Gulf GCC countries, and to also provide contribution of the private sector through Kuwait projects with the private sector, encouraging them to contribute in developing solar systems and develop the efficiency of utilizing electricity. Of course, there's a lot to talk about that. The government established upper committee under the Council of Ministers to look and developing a country's strategic program and to coordinate all the efforts between Kuwait, Ministry of Electricity and Water, Ministry of Public Works, Kuwait Municipality, and KISR, and Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science. The renewable energy is important, has many benefits been already discussed, and we feel we are moving in the right track. However, renewable energy cannot cover the country and provide complete energy for the need of the country. It has to be integrated with other sources of energy, especially as a source from the petroleum. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Samira. Now, last but not least, I'd like to call upon Mr. Jeremy Short, who's the Power Sector Director, Environment and Infrastructure Solutions UK for Wood plc. Jeremy.
Good morning, everybody. I've taken great lengths to put my presentation together, and I've got 2 slides, so I will keep this short. I think we've established the fact that already that renewables actually are a good thing. I think we've established that there's a lot of activity going on. Really, what I was interested in doing is looking at... am I on the... All right, my presentation's not there. Okay. Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Sorry. So I thought what I would do is actually look at some of the challenges. And this is more going to be around the GCC, because that's the bit of the Arab world that I know best. Because there's certain things that need to be overcome to be able to implement significant renewable energy projects. I'm going to start just with 4... Oh, sorry. I'm not going to talk about all these. These are just the 4 sort of headline ones that I think are a problem, or not a problem, a challenge, I should say. First of all, the economics. As you'll know, in the GCC particularly, energy is a highly subsidised industry. Energy to the domestic and to commercial is fairly controlled and supported by governments. That's changing, but obviously it makes the economic analysis of renewables projects slightly different. So you have to think about the economics of how you promote renewables slightly differently. Policy and regulation. We've heard that policy and regulation is developing. It's actually coming along quite well, but there's a lot to be done, I think, in terms of maturing that policy and regulation framework. And that framework can actually inspire not only development of standard renewables, but it could also look at ways of promoting innovation. There's some really interesting things in the UK that have been developed because of the political and policy and regulation regimes. Energy demand, it's been mentioned. Energy demand is a real challenge. Energy demand across the GCC is still going up fairly high. So while you're trying to decarbonise your energy system, which is all part of the energy transition, you're also being hit by ever-increasing energy demand. So trying to balance all that out and trying to do things at a rate that's going to make a real difference to your energy transition programmes is a genuine challenge. And then there's technical issues or technological issues. And I'm actually just going to spend a little bit of time on those because I think the others have been covered or can be discussed. I'm not going to talk about the technologies, as Frank was saying. They're reasonably mature. Certainly, wind and solar is very mature, and that includes concentrated solar, which I think has a real place in the GCC, partly around the storage piece. Cost of all that is coming down, and there are other technologies that can come along. And there's some R&D that's needed around new technologies, but I'll come to that at the end. What I want to concentrate on is if you're going to implement a big renewables program, then you've got certain challenges, particularly around your grid. Suddenly, instead of having big centralised power plant that feed into a grid, you've now got distributed power generators all over the grid, sometimes coming into the low voltage system, sometimes the high voltage system, and therefore you need to reconfigure and rethink about how your grid actually works, and that's quite a challenge. Not an issue at the moment because penetration of renewables in the GCC is not high enough for that to be an issue, but it will become an issue, and it certainly is becoming an issue in the UK when we're up to, as Frank was saying, around 35%. You've got some very big geographies, Saudi and Oman particularly, so you've got lots of isolated settlements, a lot of long distances between settlements. You've got a way of thinking about it new. Should you actually be running strings between or wires between all these places? Could you go for isolated grids? Could you put hybrid systems up? Think of a new way of thinking rather than just going down the old system of wiring everybody up with overhead pylons. I think there's real opportunities and there's some real interesting work being done on isolated grids, independent grids. And Oman and Saudi are doing things, particularly around there. Not so much of a problem for the smaller countries. Interconnector, we've heard about the interconnector. The interconnector is an interesting one in as much as, yes, it's great to be able to transmit energy between sectors. You need a market structure, really, if you're going to make it work properly, but it does help balance loads. And if the interconnector system is spread across the wider part of the Arab field, that would be an interesting way of actually helping the next point, which is around grid balancing. Grid balancing, again, it comes about because of the variability of renewables. So as you've got the sun going down or the wind not blowing, suddenly energy's coming on and off the grid quite quickly. You've got to make sure that when that customer of yours turns the light on, his light actually comes on, or the air conditioning is still working. So you've got to balance out. So you've got to decide whether you're going to go for big, heavy base load. In the energy transition piece, that would probably be something like conventional with carbon capture and storage. Saudi already has a demonstrator plant for carbon capture and storage. Actually, that brings in an interesting point. That's linked to enhanced oil recovery. So I think when you think about renewables, actually, you just think about energy. Anywhere that energy is used, renewables can be applied. So the oil and gas sector, which is obviously the biggest sector in the GCC, actually, renewables can be used in that sector, and that is being used in that sector. If you look at the Glass Point project in Oman, that's going to be a gigawatt of steam generation from concentrated solar for advanced oil recovery. So it's not just building plant to put into wires to put into houses. Renewables could be applied in all sorts of different places. You can do, if your base load's sorted, but you've still got peaking problems, you can actually just generate by small, very simple open cycle gas plant, things like that. So as the solar drops off, or as the wind drops off, you fire these plants up. They can be turned on and off very quickly. They're not very clean. You've got to have them sitting around not doing anything for a long time. So is that the best way forward? Storage, Frank mentioned storage. One of the things that is a challenge with storage is actually getting to the level of sort of gigawatt hours of storage. You know, we're not talking about putting a little 50 megawatt here and there. You know, if you're going to do a real transition, you need major storage. So you've got systems, you've got chemical systems, which are batteries or hydrogen. You've got physical systems, things like, actually interesting enough, a hydro pump storage, which Dubai is looking at, up in the hills at Hatta. You've got compressed air, you've got liquid air. There's various systems being developed that can provide high levels of storage. Those storage, that becomes really critical if you're going to really try and decarbonise your network, especially if you're trying to avoid that big baseload component. And finally, just there are lots of things coming along, a lot of development, some of it around improving existing technologies, some of it around trying to develop new technologies, particularly around the storage, as I've just mentioned. I think the Middle East has an interesting option. There is, you know, with the oil prices it is at the moment, there's a lot of money going into renewables in the Middle East, so there's a chance for sort of early adoption of technologies and therefore picking up potential IP on some of these technologies to generate an industry in the region that could then export to the world. And I know people like the Saudi Aramco New Ventures Fund are looking at that sort of thing. So I think that's an interesting aspect of the sort of economic position of the Middle East. And R&D. There's a lot of R&D going on in the UK on this, a lot of R&D going on in the Middle East on this. And I think collaboration between those is really interesting, and some interesting things could come out of it. And I think as a concluding point, all those issues are issues that the UK has faced. So I think the UK has some real skill and understanding in all these things. I have to promote Wood Group. We actually do a lot of this sort of stuff ourselves as well. So there's a lot of companies like ours that can support and advise on these things. So I think that collaboration between the Middle East, the Arab world, and the UK on overcoming the challenges of implementing renewables, I think, is a real opportunity going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. Before we close the session, we've perhaps got time for 2 or 3 questions, if there are any burning questions out there. Gentleman here, would you like to stand up and introduce yourself? Sorry? Okay, you're not asking me a question, you're asking somebody else in the room. That's interesting. The lady there.
My question is...
Could you stand up and introduce yourself, please?
My name is Terhas, originally from Eritrea. I've been based in Europe for some years, so I'm British also.
Thank you.
But I'm in the area of renewable energy and climate change. The question to Dr. Saad is, do you use geothermal energy? If not, why?
Sorry, could you... geothermal energy?
Yeah. Do you apply?
That's a question too. I think it's for you, actually. Do you have any geothermal resources in the GCC?
Not in the GCC. I think in the Horn of Africa, they're developing, they're trying to tap it. We've had discussions with New Zealand, which is a pioneering state in developing geothermal energy, but so far we're focused mainly 95%, as I said, on fossil fuels.
Next question over there, the lady halfway back.
Hi, Lamis from United Bank. I want to ask Frank, you're talking about UK having...
Would you like to introduce yourself first, please?
Yeah, Lamis from Ahli United Bank in London. Frank, you talked about UK having 2050 zero emission. What about flights, I think, and airports and planes? Is that also included? Thanks.
Frank, is that for you, I think?
Yeah, I think the question is about the net zero emissions target for 2050 in the UK, which has recently been adopted. Internal transport is included in that, but international aviation, there's a certain carve-out, if you like, for international aviation, which means that that will be treated a little bit differently, is my understanding. But I think that some of the details are yet to be confirmed.
Okay, yes, gentleman here.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Luay Bataina from Oman. Actually, I'm
He
a
has been
investment
raising
banker
his hand
of our
for a while.
capital. My question to lady and gentlemen, regarding renewable energy in Oman, we just started this line of business and it's been legalized now as renewable energy. My question, since most of non-renewable energy has been subsidized in the Gulf, and to present renewable energy even across the Middle East, how we can monetize the renewable energy? By doing R&D to commercialize this, or asking more from private sector, or subsidize the renewable energy? Thank you.
Yes, you.
I think the first excellent question. One reason why we don't have more renewable energies because fossil energies are subsidized, and I think that's the key. I think we have to use the price mechanism to bring the prices up to international prices for energy, for fossil energies, to allow the others to compete. And then it will be difficult to compete because they are new. So they need to be helped, not through subsidies, because I'm opposed to subsidies, but by other ways that I mentioned earlier. And one of them, as you said, research and development, help them open new markets, help them develop new technologies. But the first step will be to correct the distortion in the energy prices while providing the lower income users with help with cash payments, but not subsidize the energy use for everybody.
Last question from the gentleman in the front who's been wanting to ask a question for a while.
In fact, Mr. Abdulaziz talked about that we can cooperate with Iraq in that kind of electricity with renewable energy and solar energy that will give Iraq 330 days in Iraq, 330 days per year in Iraq. But how could we cooperate? Is there an investment or energy transfer? What's the mechanism? So just need to be clear. Thank you very much.
بس للتوضيح هو النقاش مع الحكومة.
To improve the discussion with the Iraqi government, we discussed it with the Iraqi government to connect the south of Iraq with the Gulf network of electricity and not solar energy. Talking about the Gulf network based on oil, but that will make good prices for the Iraq because it's a big market in Iraq, and we tried this in the Gulf. When we connected the 6 countries, the price has gone down and there was better efficiency, and at the same time the efficiency, the energy did not stop for 9 years except for just like minutes or seconds.
الركات القديمة اللي تبدأ بالخمسينات.
ممتاز.
علي بالخمسينات، احنا اليوم ليش تظلمونا؟ احنا دخلنا حروب، دخلنا بيئة ملوثة، فاحنا نحاول على الطاقة المجددة، على الطاقة الشمسية، كل هذا نشكركم جدا.
لا هي شبكة جديدة اللي في العراق يعني من بعد 2003 مش من ال50.
It's a new grid in Iraq, not from the 50s. It's all actually not really working good, and it's not generating good energy. We hope that you help us in this energy matter.
Very much to all our speakers for a very entertaining session. I hope you could join me in a round of applause for them. Thank you very much.